Families, institutions, nations, and the entire international community have been gravely affected by COVID-19. The pandemic has ravaged the country in a scope that has never been felt by our generation. The poor are becoming poorer, small businesses are closing down, unemployment rates have skyrocketed, corruption in government institutions is very much alive and well, while their citizens are suffering from scarcity and the deprivation of means to public welfare.
Underlying all the woes of the people are also several social, political, and ethical issues that have been elucidated as the pandemic ensues. But such issues are not simply abstract, nor are their implications restricted only to some social classes here in the Philippines. The magnitude of their effects are being felt on a national level, and thus it concerns everyone in the community, regardless of class and ideology.
Among those issues is the online sexual exploitation of children, otherwise shortened to OSEC, which is described by End Child Prostitution in Asian Tourism International as an activity that includes, but is not limited to, grooming, live streaming, consuming material, which shows the abuse and exploitation of children, coercing, and blackmailing children into sexual acts. In short, it is a deviant act that could only be characterized as stomach-turning and despicable, perpetuated by predators against the youth of tomorrow. Moreover, UNICEF and Child's Rights Networks, as cited in ABAD, briefly explained why the Philippines is susceptible to such an issue.
Actually, according to UNICEF and Child Rights Network, poverty, easy access to money remittance centers, cheap Wi-Fi connections, and gadgets such as phones, and good English skills are some of the factors that contribute towards the proliferation of OSEC. Prevailing norms of secrecy and lack of parental supervisions may also strengthen the escalation of this said worsened as the pandemic continued. Researchers such as Kana and Makairan have both reported on this and have found that the Philippines is considered as the global hotspot for child sexual exploitation and that cases of OSEC have tripled ever since the lockdown began.
But the pandemic has also facilitated the worsening of another issue: misinformation, malinformation, and disinformation, which are topics that are better explored by some of our contemporaries, such as COVID PH.
So it is not foreign news to us that fake news or false news tend to spread quickly here in social media, and a lot of Filipinos tend to be gullible towards it. So thus, in an age of false news and misconceptions, we must remember that professionals and experts, such as our panelists here today, are here to provide us with accurate and reliable information before we attempt to remedy the issues of today.
Without further ado, we are Protection Against Child Exploitation, launching the initiative Kampante Kids PH. Kampante meaning comfortable in Filipino, we advocate for a more comfortable and safer space for our children and breaking the norms of secrecy prevailing in our society.
We are your hosts, Berlin Argonia and Gabriel Pascua, and joining us today are two panelists from UP Diliman. Our first panelist is Miss Maraya Carmina Eliatco. She is currently studying in Master of Arts in Psychology at UP Diliman, and she works under Psychosocial Support Specialist at UP Diliman Psychosocial Services and University Research Associate. She has had experience working with young adults as well who have been victims of sexual abuse as children. And moving forward, our second panelist is Miss Alaya Gabriel Esnemenzo. She is currently studying Master of Arts in Psychology with Clinical Psych Focus at UP Diliman as well. She works as a counselor at a DSWD licensed but privately run and funded child caring agency called Gentle Hands. She has been providing counseling for child and teen survivors of abuse under supervision by a licensed psychologist. Lastly, she has had experience as well working with kids who were victims of OSEC.
Now, our first panelist is most knowledgeable when it comes to approaching OSEC as a persistent issue that could impart in children an unshakable form of trauma.
And so, we welcome Ms. Yatko to help us understand the magnitude of OSEC in the long run. But before we further dive into the OSEC discussion itself, Miss Yatka, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I think you guys introduced me already a while ago, so that's basically it. Just for your information, I haven't had any experience working with children who have been victims of OSEC. No, so like you guys said, my work is usually with young adults, college students, actually, and some of them have been victims of sexual abuse as children, and may iba na ongoing pa rin yung abuse. So sila usually yung demographic ko I have yet to work with people who have been victims of OSIC. So I think mas si Alaya yung makakapagbigay ng info tungkol doon. No? So siguro what I can give you is like more a general background of maybe abuse, no, and maybe Alaya will go more into the online component of it. So about myself, I actually just started practicing doing psychotherapy back in 2018. Before that, I was a preschool teacher. So, and so 2 years na akong nagbibigay ng psychotherapy. So that's basically my background with in the field with practicing.
So, Miss Yatko, concerning the academe, what was your view or knowledge on OSEC before entering college, and what has changed since then?
Before, yes, really long ago. Before college, I'd say I was not aware, no, of these things that were going on. I'm what do you call this? I came from a very, very sheltered school and family background, and hindi ako active noong time na yun na maghanap ng news about these sorts of issues. I think the closest that I came was researching on human trafficking for an assignment in school. So, and I wasn't aware that these things could happen online. I wasn't very tech savvy. I wasn't on social media before college. No. So I didn't think that these things could happen. And I think what changed now a lot, because I started using social media and all these features kept popping up. And because of all these additional features, you hear more news then about it. We're more exposed to news about these kinds of things that are going on in our country and in other countries also. And I think, I guess in my practice, medyo napahanap din ako ng ibang resources about more on sexual abuse, because you want to learn how to address your clients' concerns. So it's aside from just the information coming in, it's also I also started actively looking for information right now that I've been working in the field.
I feel like a lot of Filipinos can relate to you, because even I only became educated towards OSEC when I read an article from Rappler that the cases have tripled ever since the lockdown began. Because I feel like a lot of Filipinos have this mindset na if they haven't really seen any pictures of OSEC or anything relating it, they don't really see it as an urgent problem that requires an urgent solution. So
That's true.
I feel like a lot of Filipinos really need to open their eyes regarding this issue. So, like earlier, we stated your occupation. Now, how has working with victims changed your perspective on things?
Siguro, paano ba? Like, kung hindi ako comfy with abuse, I mean, if it's like you said, it's something that really makes you, it really makes you wonder, like, why these things happen, no? So, kung hindi ako comfy dati, kung galit ako dati sa mga ganun, lalo na din ngayon. So, hearing it from people who have experienced it, talaga magagalit ka. And when I started out, I think my focus was more on, we have to do something. We have to report your abuser, especially if the abuse was ongoing at that time. And sometimes it wasn't what the client wanted. The client didn't want to report their abuser because sometimes, in some cases, these were family members, these were their boyfriends, these were their partners, and they were stuck in a place where they couldn't report also, aside from the fact that they didn't want. And that frustrated me. And when I was in that place of being very, very frustrated and being stuck in wanting and getting something done about it, dun ako na stuck. And over time, you kind of realize that, you know what, it's not your, paano ba, it's not you who should be directing how the person wants to recover. Sila dapat yung mag-decide kung ano yung gusto nilang gawin. Sila dapat yung mag-decide kung ano yung tulong na kailangan nila. No? And sort of, that's something that I learned, like, you know, shifting the power to the client, to the victim. No? Because yun yung nawawala sa abuse eh. Parang, when the abuse happens to them, they lose control. Sometimes they feel helpless. And providing them with a setting that sort of gives them the idea that, okay, here I have power, here I have control. Then I'm trying. I'm still trying to get to that point, not to really switch the power dynamic back to them. So it's a work in progress, but I'm trying to do it. Yeah.
So, how do you cope after dealing with OSEC cases? And do you think it has affected you psychologically as well?
Yeah, hindi nawawala yung maaapektuhan ka talaga. Hindi ako robot. So, what do you call this? It affects me psychologically in a way that, well, for one, of course, I still feel angry. And sometimes when the client or the student comes in there with very, very overwhelming feelings, you really can't help but empathize then. So you feel sad for them, you feel angry, you feel the anxiety in that moment with them. But what helps me sometimes is really just to have one foot in and the other foot out. So at the same time that you're with them in their struggles, hindi ka napapadala. You also have to remember, wait lang, I'm supposed to be helping you, no, in a way. So I'm not saying that it's kind of like a 50-50 between being very, very immersed and being very, very detached. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
So not the same. And something else that really helps is doing consultations with our colleagues and our clinical supervisors. So we have, because Alaya and I are not yet licensed psychologists, we both have clinical supervisors in our field. So these are licensed psychologists who have more experience. So we talk to them about our clients and we get their input or their feedback on how we should be helping them. No, so that's something that really helps also. So dun mo din na ilalabas kung ano yung nararamdaman mo.
So, what were also the difficulties you faced when you first started working with victims of child abuse, or OSEC to be specific, especially with regards to the kind of trauma that a child may experience going through it?
Well, since I don't have experience with OSEC and dealing with children in the therapeutic settings, there maybe some difficulties that I encountered with like young adults and adolescents. It was difficult. Siguro mas yung naging focus namin was how to manage your emotions nila that comes with the memories of the abuse, especially if these things happen when they were kids, no? So it's been very challenging because you can't quite, I haven't had experience with this, so I can't quite comprehend in what they're going through. And sometimes for me, parang medyo naiilang din ako na, like, do I ask them to explain, no? Because it might make things worse if they talk about it. I mean, for the how many time, I'm sure they've explained it to authorities before in the past. So dun din ako na nahihirapan, like ano yung tamang tempo of getting them to disclose. And also, of course, before that, building the trusting relationship with them. Kasi minsan they might have this certain idea about relationships that it's difficult now to trust people because of abuse that they have encountered. So how do you build that with somebody who has this wall? So siguro yun yung mga challenges na encounter ko so far.
Regards naman po sa occupation nyo is, di ba wala pa pong experience regarding sa dealing with cases with children. But in the future, how do you think it would differ handling cases with yung adolescents and when it comes to children naman po?
I think one big difference is, of course, involving the family. Because when you're talking about children, you have to also coordinate with a lot of different service providers or the people in their environment. So maybe if they have, this is based on my experience as a teacher naman, because I've also coordinated with specialists about children with special needs. So in that case, you had their developmental pediatrician, their speech therapist, their occupational therapist. So the same, I'm not sure, this is an assumption. So I'm imagining that it would be the same also if you're dealing with children. You also have to be talking to the different people that they're receiving interventions from. So maybe a counselor would talk to the social worker or other counselors who are interacting or who are providing services to their families naman. So there has to be a very, very strong coordination to provide holistic services. So yun lang yung nakikita kong difference between working with young adults and children so far. So yeah.
So thank you very much, Ms. Yatko, for thoroughly educating us with regards to the kind of trauma that a child may experience due to becoming an OSEC victim. So as you have stated to us, na it's about shifting the power dynamics back to the victim themselves, as the event might render them to feel powerless. And also important din po, based from what you've said, is rapport building when it comes to victims. Yun po.
So we're now going to move forward to our second panelist. She'll be providing us a whole new perspective of OSEC and some personal insights that she has picked up throughout her years in the academe.
That's right. And so without further ado, we would like to introduce Ms. Alaya Gabriel S. Namenzo. A warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Gab. So I think, well, just to give you a short background then on my experience, like Micah said, not yet a licensed psychologist, but I started in 2017 that I started seeing cases while under practicum, that is with young adults. And then yung work ko as a counselor at an orphanage, around that time then, I started seeing children and teens. Pero generally, abuse ang backgrounds nila, not necessarily sexual abuse only. But we have had some cases na may cyber component yung sexual abuse nila. So, ayun. And then, did you want me to share ano yung views ko about OSEC before entering college?
Yes, before entering college, then during, and most importantly po, what changed after po nung experience po sa academe?
Okay. Well, online sexual exploitation, I guess, it was very abstract to me. Ang experience ko lang, I guess, with it ay nawawarn ako. And maybe I heard other young girls being warned then not to share certain images online, not to talk to strangers, mga ganyan. But I never really personally knew anyone who was a survivor. But as I pursued further studies in psych, naging area of interest ko din kasi yung child trauma. I mean, personal interest siya, so I read up on it. And I guess also because it was very relevant in my work sa orphanage. But then I began to understand kasi the nuances of yung impact ng different forms of abuse and how that affects the development of this human being. Diba? Kasi in childhood, you're developing and so many things are being formed. And the impact on that is so big, and sometimes the impact of abuse really carries over into adulthood unless sensitive intervention is provided. So yun, theory, I learned a bit about what a glimpse or a picture of how abuse affects the victims. Pero nagkaroon talaga siya ng kulay when I started to meet young people who were survivors of those kinds of experiences.
So when it comes po sa, since you have mentioned earlier that you have worked with victims in orphanages po that have a background of abuse, parang what do you think po yung nuance or yung difference niya as with other children experiencing OSEC or at least exploitation po?
So in particular for children in institutions or in centers?
In institutions po.
Okay, well, I think a big factor is hindi nila kasama yung pamilya nila. Usually, the kids in centers have been rescued from their families because either their families were involved in the crime in OSEC or hindi nila maprotektahan because of the nature of the community. Baka masyadong malakas yung impluensya ng perpetrator within the community. So they had to be removed and transferred to a safer place. Malaking bagay that the kids don't have their families there. Pero if they have adults who feel safe and provide physical and psychological safety to them, that's a big help for their stability and their recovery. But yun, with kids naman who are not in centers, malaking factor yung support of the family. If their family believes their disclosures of abuse, if their family makes steps to make them safe. Yun.
So parang yung you're in the position since yung children's in these institutions don't have a kumbaga familial foundation by which they can develop and form, parang professionals, counselors and health workers would stand as parang secondary parent to them. Pero how do you cope po with that kind of situation, especially since yung experiences po nila is sobrang mabigat, knowing well na wala po silang family to provide for po?
Sorry, before I answer that, I'd just like to point out something doon sa being second parents. In the institution where I work, ang magandang sistema kasi ay the caregivers, it's the caregivers mismo who stand as the second parent. So parang may surrogate parentship or may way that they receive corrective parenting experiences, parang better parenting experiences in a way. And then, how do I cope? Well, like Micah said, mahirap talaga to be on the listening end of such horrific stories. And lalo na when you have empathy, kasi hindi ka naman pwedeng robot pag nakikinig diba, sa kanila. We're people also. So, it's very challenging and draining emotionally and psychologically. But a big help really, like Micah said, is yung supervision that we get to debrief, still with confidentiality, no? But we get to debrief and see where we are, how we are. Malaking bagay din talaga yung self-care for anyone in the helping profession, so whether social worker or sa medical field, because we can burn out and we can't help anyone if we burn out, diba? So self-care can take different forms for different people. My self-care includes eating good food, watching movies or videos, disconnecting from social media now and then, and connecting on a daily basis with loved ones. Yan.
Do you think po na for professionals and workers in this kind of field po, important din po na aside from yung self-care is magkaroon po ng support system? And if yes po, why?
Yes, we have practices like supervision. Someone more senior than us provides guidance and debriefing. Meron din tayong tinatawag na peer supervision where among our colleagues we get to discuss. It's very important kasi in order to be able to process parang what you're going through as a counselor, iba yung may insight from people who are going through something similar in handling cases. Iba din yung insight that you get from people who have worked with cases like that before. So the learning is very rich and personally, nakaka-enrich din siya, not just cognitively. No.
Now, given those yung insights po, even if meron pong insights na na-receive from superiorities or peers, parang ano po yung main difficulties when you first handle this kind of cases po? Especially since yung fresh from the academe, tas ito po yung mga, it's very heavy. So, ano po yung nga po, difficulties na na-experience niyo po?
Personally, ang hirap makita from kids and teens. Ang hirap marinig yung stories. Parang you have the instinct of wanting to protect them. Or parang I want to protect you. Parang ganon. So that was hard. But as a counselor din, sometimes it's difficult to communicate things in the same way that you would communicate it to an adult. So sometimes I've had to be very creative in the medium or in the way that we talk about things. We use stories, we use play, we might use dolls or a house, yung ganyan. Because we don't want the sessions to be invasive or parang seem like it's control over the kid or the teen. We want the teen to be able to find their voice. So some of it uses creative strategies for them to be able to express themselves. And although sometimes mas complicated pag may legal case kasi you have to get the kid's narrative. Parang part of what we do kasi is also helping the social workers prepare the kids for legal cases, court hearings. Can you imagine, diba, parang having to have the kid tell their story again and again, and sometimes it's not even done very sensitively. Sometimes it's in a crowded police precinct or maraming taong nakaka-overhear sa fiscal's office, yung ganyan. So, I guess the challenge is how to make it child-centered, how to make it very sensitive, and empower the child or the teen, even as we recognize that it's a very hard thing to go through. I think it's also a good reminder for me to recognize the child or the teen's inner resilience too. Because they are not, well, even if I see a lot of negative impact on them, you will see, when you see them as people and not just victims, you will see the strength then. You will see resources that they have. And I think that's a very beautiful thing to focus on as well as they're recovering.
Yun po. So, one last question before the conclusion for this segment. Ano po yung you've mentioned na yun nga po, heavy sa kanila and usually very impersonal yung pagtatanong sa legal matters po. How do workers usually prepare them, especially through creative means, to build resilience po on their own and through guidance po?
I think one of the very first priorities na ginagawa namin with clients who have to go through the legal process is we help them find words for what they feel. That's very important. That they know and they can recognize how they're feeling and they can communicate it. And another is that they know they have tools to regulate their emotions. So parang we teach them grounding techniques, we teach them, relaxation exercises, progressive muscle relaxation, ganyan. To help them gain a sense of, even if the emotions might come as I'm telling the story, there's something I can do about it.
Thank you so much, Ms. Namanza, for enlightening us regarding the psychological implications of OSEC on its victims. As Ms. Namanza stated, growing up, a child will always depend on their families or parents specifically, but these orphans have no family to depend on anymore, so they lean on to their second parents, and hence it is very difficult to build a connection and trust with them. So victims of child abuse or OSEC need to feel like they're being heard and their voice is not dismissed in any way. So it is very hard and difficult at first, not just for the victim itself, but also on the people hearing them out to explain such a heavy thing without the victim feeling triggered in any way. So it is very important for us to be sensitive when it comes to communicating with them in order for them to build that connection with you.
And as Ms. Namanzo has taught us, the psychological implication of exploitation in children, especially when it comes to the subset of orphanage children, that really resilience is something that should be built, especially when these children don't have any familiar foundation by which they can attach to. And these workers, as well as they themselves, should have a valid support system in order to guide them through such a journey. Now, it is also not new to us that there's a rapid growth in the number of OSEC cases here in the Philippines. That being said, for the next portion of our panel discussion, we will be having a question and answer segment so as to direct the discussion towards how the community can contribute and how people can address the misconceptions of OSEC to provide a much more safer space for children.
Please do note that all questions will be directed to both panelists. That being said, the floor is now open for the question and answer segment of this program. Feel free to ask any questions now.
Yes, Andrea.
Good morning po. My question po is, how can we be more considerate to ASIC victims?
Siatko, then Ms. Nemenzo po.
How can you be more considerate? So if you know somebody who has been a victim of OSEC and they disclosed their story to you, maybe something that you could do is try to listen without judgment, and parang just be that safe space for them to disclose. And at the same time, be aware of your limits also. So parang, siguro let them know din, like, in a kind of compassionate way, like if you're not ready to hear it. So maybe you can say something like, yeah, thanks for sharing this with me. Thanks for trusting me with your story, but I'm not sure if I'm the right person to help you. How can I help you? You can ask them, ano ba yung tulong na kailangan mo mula sa akin? And people would say naman what they need from you. So maybe they just need somebody who might listen or somebody na makipagchikahan lang just to get their mind off things. And you can also tell them like, oh, this is how I can help you, or I can help you find professional help. That would be also a big way to show consideration also, or to show kindness towards somebody. Parang providing them with relevant information that might be able to help them if that's what they need, or if that's what they want rather.
Thank you so much for that insight. Now, Ms. Nemenzo po.
Yeah. If it's part of what they want, when we have cases of abuse, ganyan, part of it is checking what options are there to make them safe. So if gusto ng person to go somewhere else, for physical safety, or exploring those options with them might be good. But definitely, yung sabi ni Mike na help, seeking for professional help then, that's a big step. That's a good step. Aside from that, I think with any survivor of abuse, it's helpful that we see them as more than just their experiences. So we don't talk about them as that kid who has those sex videos or that OSEC victim, but we relate to them as human beings, seeing them as people without labels. So yun nga, nakwento ko yung the kids and teens I work with. When you actually spend time to play with them or talk to them, you won't minsan guess their histories of abuse, because they're each so beautiful with their own personalities and their own strengths. Also, I like the language of survivor instead of victim, because it places the emphasis on the person's resilience to survive in spite of the horrible experience of OSEC or other forms of abuse. And it helps imbibe a sense of empowerment instead of helplessness. Na hindi sila defined by their designation as a mere victim, but they can actively take control of their lives and their future. I think another thing that we can be careful is not to blame them in subtle ways. When they're talking about their experience, asking things like, why didn't you do this? Or didn't you realize na mali na yung ginagawa niya sa'yo? Sometimes that can be very invalidating, Kasi when you're in that position, there is a sense of control over you. There's a sense of confusion, of isolation, and of fear that often makes it difficult for OSEC survivors to get out of that abusive situation. So we just listen with openness and non-judgment. And we make sure they know that we are there to listen to them, support them, but we respect their stories and their space. So kasi sometimes people try to make a conversation by being curious about the experience or making a talking point, where it might increase feelings of judgment and rejection. May risk na ganun. So part of the healing and gaining back a sense of agency for survivors is that they decide for themselves when, where, and how to tell their stories. And when they're ready to speak, we listen with understanding and respect, and in a way that affirms their dignity and creates a safe space for them.
Thank you po.
Sino yung next na magtatanong?
Hello po. This question could be directed po to either Miss Yako or Miss Alaya po. So, regarding about your stories with the victims of sexual abuse, exploitation of whatever means, either online or something, how did their experiences or maybe their coping mechanisms affect their potential growth and maturity?
So, sorry, how did their coping mechanisms affect their growth and maturity?
Yes, and also the experience that the sort of experience that the experiences of the abuse that they had, how did it affect their growth? Mostly.
Okay, that's interesting. Because people would cope with it in different kinds of ways, no? Siguro the more, paano ba? More common reactions would be to have fear, or to be anxious about the abuse, no? So that would lead to the urge to avoid things that would, maybe if the abuse happened in the past, to avoid things that would remind them of their experience, no? Or maybe to avoid seeking those kinds of close relationships because maybe the abuse taught them that I can't trust people. So parang that kind of coping, ano ba, like avoiding these kinds of things could lead to difficulties later on, like you said, with their maturity, growing up. It would lead to some difficulties in relationships because they're going into a relationship, especially for adolescents and young adults, wherein it's important for them to seek connections or to seek very deep relationships with other people. They're coming in with already this kind of unwritten law in their head that this person, maybe I can't trust this person. No, parang may alanganin na pagpasok pa lang. So, and it makes it difficult. So sometimes that would lead them to avoid making deep relationships that could help them in the long run, no? And another thing is that, what else? Maybe it could lead to difficulties coping with other difficulties. So parang, like, if a certain strategy works for them in coping with the abuse, then maybe parang may idea din sila na, okay, I can apply it to other situations when it might not be the same thing. Another situation might be different than another, and it might not work in that kind of situation. So those are the kinds of challenges that I see for, especially in the long run. But then I'm sure there are more, no, but yet to look them up. So yeah, muna.
Thank you very much. Now, moving on to Ms. Napunza.
Yeah, I think something that we see and is also seen in the literature is that the younger kasi the child is when the abuse happens, mas malaki yung impact niya on development. And research does show na abuse in general has impacts on even physical development, cognitive development, socio-emotional development. But there is also research that when the child is provided with a safe environment and support intervention, nakaka-catch up developmentally. With regards to Yeah, I think kasi kung kunyari they were in their teens when the abuse happened, usually parang mas mabilis yung recovery compared to when if the abuse happened really young. And it also depends on how long the abuse lasted. It also depends on sino yung perpetrator, if it was someone they really trusted, someone in their family, a parent, or if it was a stranger. Magkaiba yon. Mas malaki yung sense of betrayal and yung sense of confusion and yung impact on identity kapag ka-family member. No? So there are many factors as to what determines yung impact on the survivor's development.
I see po. Thank you.
So, thank you, Miss Yatko and Miss Namenzo, for educating us on the impact of becoming a sexual abuse victim or an OSEC victim or survivor when it comes to their development. So let's move on to the next question being asked from our another fellow member.
Good morning po. So, my question po is, what do you think can be improved in the current available services for OSEC survivors?
Okay, so, well, disclaimer, I have not yet had any experiences working with in the other services that are involved for OSEC survivors. But based on what I've been reading, it looks like malaki din yung law enforcement. Malaki yung factor ng law enforcement in how the survivor gets help. So, parang yung na-experience ko lang ay yung kwento ng, let's say, may magre-report ng abuse sa barangay, tapos sasabihin lang sila na, problema pang pamilya yan. So they wouldn't do anything about it. So it's very, sometimes when, when people aren't so aware about these kinds of problems and that you need legal action for some of them, actually for all of them, what do you call this? Parang wala, it removes the responsibility. When you say that, okay, it's nasa family lang yan, no? So, I think in that area, parang maybe certain law enforcement institutions could really, really specify what the boundaries are, no? Ano yung problemang pampamilya and ano yung kailangan na talaga na action. And also, too, I think kailangan din na parang trauma-informed, parang certain processes have to be more trauma-informed when it comes to dealing with survivors. Like what Alaya said, minsan nga may mga, yung parang nasa interrogation sila, tapos madaming tao, they ask them to repeat the story again and again, when in fact that's not something very helpful for somebody who has gone through that kind of experience. So I hope not just law enforcement, but also other services could have more trauma-informed processes that could really facilitate better the help that the survivor would need.
Thank you very much. Now, next po ulit kay Ms. Numan.
Okay, I think my program's on the SWD, but I'm not so familiar with the range of programs. I think certain centers have their own interventions for survivors of sexual abuse in general. Pero I can really only speak based on my experience. Medyo similar yung sagot ko with Micah na one of the things I'd like to see is yung more sensitive and child-centered processes as you go through yung legal process, no? And sana magkaroon ng available support, psychosocial support for children and teens and their families who are pursuing legal action, because it's really a very harrowing or difficult experience.
So thank you so much again, Ms. Yatka and Ms. Namenzo, for notifying us about this situation. Now, I would like to call on Ms. Jana May Chua to ask another question. Same order po, si Ms. Yatko muna and then Ms. Namenzo.
Good morning po. So the question is, what other programs or activities can be done to make sure that everyone has access to the help that they need?
everyone has access to the help that they need. Actually, I feel that programs should start as a preventive measure. So instead of trying to like fix what happened, we want to prevent things from happening in the first place. No? So something that would be very, very helpful is having educational programs for children and families. Lalo na ngayon na children are getting very, very tech savvy. They're on social media, they're playing online games, they're talking to strangers through these kinds of platforms. So really having like a systemic parang educational program, hopefully from their schools or from other professionals to educate them about using these kinds of platforms or using technology, and also not just children, also for families. So it's difficult for maybe an older parent to start exploring social media or to start exploring these new technologies. So hopefully somebody like maybe a professional can guide them through these things and really educate them about the risks that could happen, you know, to their children or to even to them. And another thing is because if we go to like the root of all of this, ano ba, I think you guys mentioned that widespread poverty has been, it's a really, really big factor why it's so common here in the Philippines and why we're the number one provider of these kinds of, or we're the number one in these kinds of crimes, no, on the frequencies. So if we get to address, hopefully if we get to address the poverty, uh, if there are certain programs that the government could make to support families who are having financial difficulties, then maybe they wouldn't have to resort to these kinds of crimes. So yeah, starting really with the root cause as a preventive measure would be, I think, more helpful than afterwards.
I agree. The awareness campaigns like this are helpful to provide education and to prevent, OSEC, to help protect parents and children. For help for survivors naman, I think it's important then that we provide information, like available information, or it's out there, we disseminate it. Information about who to call to get out of an abusive situation, where to get access to safe shelter, lalo na during the pandemic, this is a relevant thing. And it might be difficult. We might need help from authorities to be able to obtain access to safe shelter, and access to psychosocial support. So there are NGOs like Luna's Collective, I think, that provide online support and help for victims of gender-based violence. So merong mga ganong NGOs that I think it would be helpful if people knew about para alam nila kung ano yung resources that are available for them.
So thank you po for expounding on how we can address this issue. Also, you both of you have mentioned na there's a root cause that must, an underlying cause that must be addressed muna before we can actually start preventing cases as opposed to just addressing those existing ones kaagad. Now, I think Simon has another question. Simon.
Hello. Okay, so this question was more outsourced as during the start of our campaign, us group in PACE gave out the Google form to which we asked some of our audience on what questions they like to ask regarding OSEC. So this is one of them. Mostly this is directed to Miss Yatko po. People cope with trauma in various ways. For some OSEC victims, especially those who weren't given justice, coping with their trauma may not be what some would consider acceptable. Can coping mechanisms really be categorized into acceptable and not?
I think, ano ba? You could categorize it that way, but that's not the only way to categorize coping strategies. There are some coping strategies that are less socially acceptable than others. So some things that come to mind are maybe physical outbursts. When you're angry and then you hit something or hit somebody else, that's not it's not a socially acceptable coping mechanism, no. So yes, you could categorize it that way, but I think, well, we don't, ano ba? I personally am not so into that dichotomy. I kind of want to think of coping strategies or coping mechanisms as helpful or not, no. So you might want to see, okay, that kind of outburst, that kind of physical outburst, is there a part of it that's helpful? And is there a part of it that's not? Maybe it's helpful in the sense that, okay, I get to let my anger out. I get to express, I get to release it in that way. But the part that's not helpful is that things get broken, I hurt another person. So you take what's helpful in that coping mechanism and try to find it somewhere else. Like, is there another way for them to release that anger without having to resort to that kind of action? So in that way, I don't know, maybe acceptable and acceptable might not be, you could use it, but then like, maybe personally it just doesn't sit well with me. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
I see then. So
Yeah.
helpful and not. Okay, thank you po.
Thank you.
Also, thank you for expounding na some coping mechanisms don't really have the dichotomy of whether they're helpful or not, pero it really is through the means of how we channel such coping mechanisms. Now, Daniela, you have a question?
Yes, good morning po. I'm asking this for the benefit of aspiring researchers. What aspect of OSEC do you think needs to be explored deeper?
Let's start with Miss Nemenzo muna, then Miss Yato.
Okay. This isn't my particular field of interest in research, yung OSEC specifically. So I don't know much about the current gaps in literature on this topic. Pero I personally would like to see studies on how our culture influences families' reactions to the disclosure of survivors. Kasi research has shown na malaking impact on recovery yung support and acceptance of the family. So in cases where the family invalidates the victim's stories or the survivor's stories, mas malaki yung impact at mas mahirap for them to recover. So I'd like to see how, Filipino culture plays into that, no? How that influences yung pag-receive ng families. Another thing I'd be interested to read about is yung experiences ng OSEC survivors with our justice system and how they have been either helped or hindered in their recovery and healing because of that experience, no? with the justice system. Yeah.
Sa akin naman, based on what I've been reading so far, it looks like there are a lot of numbers, in these reports, about frequencies, but then what's kind of missing is the, ano ba, like, there are reports that majority of like the traffickers or the abusers come from the family. Sila yung they're the ones who have their children go through these kinds of experiences. And what's missing, I think, from that kind of data is the experience of the families, what drove them to do something like that. That's what I'm personally interested in also, like what kinds of circumstances forced them to do something like that. And also, from a practical standpoint, I'd also like to see more studies on best practices on handling survivors of OSEC, especially here in the local setting. Like what Alaya said, there are a lot of maybe cultural, socioeconomical, maybe historical context that comes into play with the experience of OSEC survivors. And so I'm wondering now if how would our practices change because of those kinds of nuances. So that's a more practical kind of research I'd like to see.
Thank you very much. So we've learned na we also need to scrutinize the cultural and penal system of the Philippines, as well as locally paano nga ba na-address yung ganitong situation.
For our next question will be asked from Chelsea Del Castillo.
Hi, good morning po. So, since social media plays a very important role in OSEC, what are your thoughts on parents monitoring their children online activities?
Let's start off with Miss Namenza and then Miss Yatko.
Okay, sige. Ako siguro depending on the age, monitoring would look differently. So close monitoring I think helps with children especially. Personally, I don't recommend allowing young children to use social media. Pero parents also need to realize that teaching their kids, especially preteens and teens, safe use of internet, healthy boundaries online, what red flags to avoid, will be even better. Kasi we want children and teens to become discerning consumers then. In the preteen and teen years, it becomes more difficult kasi to control and monitor them in a very restrictive way. It doesn't help to develop trust with your teen. And maybe it might foster hostility when they feel that they're being overly controlled. So I think a better way, lalo na for kids who are growing older or teens, no, is to foster open and honest conversations. That's a better alternative. So parents do need to be informed about how their kids are, what their activities online. But it's best to foster the kind of relationship that allows for open communication para the parents can still provide guidance. It will also help if the teen views their parent or the parent encourages such a relationship na makikita nung teen sila as someone they can go to for help and support if they ever find themselves in an unsafe situation. Kasi that will increase the chances na they will talk to the parent before any situation escalates into an abusive one.
Actually, parang same din yung sasabihin ko. But then, yeah, I also believe that monitoring should come to a certain extent. No? Maybe for young children who are starting to explore certain kinds of platforms. Maybe since yun nga, may online classes na sila ngayon, they're exploring these kinds of technologies like Zoom or Google Classroom. So I think to that extent, parents can provide assistance and monitoring to start more on to help them navigate these kinds of things, and of course to educate them about the risks that come with these kinds of technologies, no? And like what Elias said, it has to start with starting that dialogue. You really have to start that dialogue with your child if you're a parent. You have to educate them about on social media use, especially for older children, no? To tell them about these things and talk to them about boundaries, talk to them about sex, have that kind of difficult conversation with them. Because I don't know, kasi I think may taboo din still with regarding those kinds of conversations, and it's because some people don't want to talk about it. Other children or teens or preteens might seek that information somewhere else, you know. So if you want to have that kind of siguro yung mapapanatag ka na alam ng anak mo kung ano yung gagawin niya, talk to them about it instead of monitoring them 24/7 with their online use. Because aside from the fact that it could build distrust and hostility nga in children, nakakapagod siya as a parent, no? You're always thinking about, oh my God, what's my kid doing? No, I mean, get your mind off things. It's going to be difficult at first to have that conversation with your child, but it's like ripping off the Band-Aid. Just do it and build that kind of trust and relationship with your child, so they can also be the ones to tell you that, okay, something's wrong. There's these red flags that I see. So, ayun,
Thank you, Ms. Yatko and Ms. Namenza for your insights. So as they stated, it is kind of impossible for parents to monitor their children's online activities 24/7. Although what's important is that their parents or their fellow family members should build this trust, and that the children should be able to open up to their families or parents without any judgment present. So for our last question, Ms. Ariana Faliga.
Hi, good morning. So my question is there any particular reason that the majority of consumers of OSEC from the Philippines is from Western countries? Is it purely coincidental or is there an empirical, social, cultural, or historical grounding behind it?
So let's start with Miss Namenza and then Miss Yatko.
Okay, I think that's a very big and complex discussion to have. Malawak yung usapin na yan. But I'll say this, with the online sex trade, malaking factor ang poverty, like what was mentioned kanina, because it's actually a readily accessible form of income. And it's actually the case sometimes that families are complicit, sometimes, no, complicit in the victimization of their children in exchange for cash or material compensation. We've had several cases na it wasn't the parents, but someone in the community, and that person was providing money, food, gifts, not just to the yung children involved in OSEC, but to other children in the family and to the parents. No? So in some cases naman, it's the parents mismo who initiate the exploitation directly and stand to gain financially. And kasi it can really fetch sums. So I've read na pwedeng umabot ng like $1,000 for one night of live streaming of sexual acts done by a child. So ang laking factor talaga ng poverty, and that sometimes drives people to desperation. And the poor really are a vulnerable sector in many ways, but especially for OSEC.
So thank you, Yatko and Miss Namenza, for thoroughly helping us in terms of getting to know how intense or how the sexual abuse victims or OSEC survivors can have an impact when it comes to growing up. Thank you then for Ariana, Chelsea, Daniela, Simon, Janame, Ken, and Andrea for asking these questions. It really helped us realize what needs to be done here in the Philippines in terms of OSEC and sexual abuse issues.
So now more than ever, the prevalence of online sexual exploitation of children must be addressed. The circumstances brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic have heightened the factors that contribute to the proliferation of OSEC. This means more children are at risk of or are currently experiencing abuse in their homes.
It is also our responsibility to speak up and use our platform for good, especially our privilege, to raise awareness on the graveness of this issue. However, raising awareness is only the first step. In examining its root causes, we can come up with long-term actions that can lead to a solution.
As parents, part of their responsibility is to foster a family environment where children feel comfortable and empowered to speak up. This can be done through effective parenting and building healthy relationships with their kids. This includes encouraging the child to be share aware through teaching them to filter what they share and who they interact with online. Moreover, monitoring their internet activity is also a way to help them stay safe from predators lurking around, more so facilitating discourse and dialogue regarding taboo topics.
However, it is also a necessity to note that these solutions are on a macro level. For wide-scale change to take effect, we must urge the government and the system to take action and address the root causes of this problem. This includes ensuring socio-economic equality is prioritized in policy making and that bills specifically tackling OSEC is signed into law.
This is why in awareness, we must continuously call everyone to action, from caregivers and guardians to politicians and government agencies. Everyone has had a hand in finally putting a stop to OSEC, a crime committed to the future of our nation.
That being said, that is all for today's panel discussion. Again, we would like to extend our gratitude to our panelists for today, Ms. Mariana Carmina Eliatco and Ms. Alaya Gabriel S. Namenzo, and also to our guests who came here to listen to their professional insights. Please do remember that the fight does not stop here. Every single day, let us give one sec for OSEC and actively help in making the world a safer place for our kids. Thank you for listening and stay tuned for more information on this topic.